Shalom, my name is Shulam. I'm continuing the teaching on 1 Samuel, and I'm going to talking about 1 Samuel chapter 20, 21, and I want to give you a little bit of background. Reading the story of the relationship between Saul and David, story after story, it's clear that the writer of the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, in my opinion, is doing overtime to show that David is okay. That David is not really trying to undermine King Saul, but is doing everything to find favor in the eyes of King Saul. He goes there even though King Saul is throwing a javelin at him, trying to kill him. He goes back. King Saul swears that he's not going to kill him, doesn't keep his word. David is not portrayed as somebody who is seeking aggressively to take over the kingdom from Saul. He's portrayed as somebody who is chosen by God to be the king of Israel in place of Saul. But personally, he himself is portrayed as a very ambitious young man who believes that God has chosen him to be the king because Samuel came to his house, the house of Jesse in Bethlehem, and anointed specifically David as king. Just like Samuel anointed King Saul first before he told everybody else about him. And he had to anoint him 3 times, in Ramah privately, then in Mizpah publicly, and then after the victory over the battle of Jabesh Gilead, I guess in English you would say, he anoints him in Gilgal in front of all the representatives of all the tribes of Israel as victorious king and soldier and the head of Israel. So David, the writer of 1 Samuel, bends over backwards to show David as a fair, just person who believes God's promises and God's choice of him as the next king of Israel. The writer also portrays King Saul as a very complex person, not a bad person, but a very complex person, obsessed with an evil spirit from God, worried, fearful, insecure, driven by this evil spirit to kill David. And it's a seesaw. He wants to kill David, and then at the same time, he doesn't want to kill David. He wants to kill David and chase David, but at the same time, he has remorse, with the help of Jonathan, takes oaths, he promises that he's not going to kill David. Jonathan is portrayed in these stories as a true friend of David. as somebody who understands the problem of his father, who's somebody who is in love with David, whatever that means. And who's somebody who betrays his father in order to save his friendship and relationship with David. He's portrayed as somebody who understands his father, and he understands the will of God, and is willing to bend his own interests for his friendship, his love of David, and the will of God. The daughter of King Saul, Michal, whom David marries in the end of chapter 19, beginning of chapter 20, is also in love with David and is willing to lie to her father and sacrifice some of the loyalty to her father and to her family and to the king of Israel, King Saul, and take the side of David. This constellation actually makes for a great movie, a great novel, a great story. But we're reading the Bible. So for us as disciples of Yeshua, as God-fearing people, as people who want to know God better, this is a very interesting constellation. You've got somebody who was chosen by God that is rejected by God because of his insecurity, fears from the people more than fear from God, and vanity, and other characteristics that portray weakness, a weakness that a king, especially not the first king of Israel, can't afford to portray, to exhibit that kind of weakness. So all these things make the story very interesting, but it also shows how God works. God in this story is Deus ex machina, like in the book of Esther. He is working from behind the scenes, and he lets the main characters of the story, of the theater, forge their own future. He allows them to make the mistakes it's hard for us to conceptualize this, because we look at God as a benevolent Father who loves us and loves his world and loves his children and loves Israel and loves the whole humanity. So it's hard for us to look at God in the light of the book of Samuel and other books as well, as somebody who gives in to the will of the people, knowing already ahead of time that the kingship in Israel is going to bring to a disaster. When the people, the elders of Israel, come to Samuel and say, we want the king to be like all the other nations, a king of flesh and blood, to lead us and to guide us, and Samuel says, no, God is your king, you're rejecting God as your king. And Samuel goes to God and he hopes God will say, no, don't give him a king, God says, you know what? They want a king, give him a king. But this is what the king is going to do. A, B, C will take your children to the army, your daughters as concubines. taxes and everything else. So in a way, we see a God here who understands his creatures, us, the human beings, and because he has chosen to make us people with intelligence, with imagination, with the ability to love, which requires free choice. Love without free choice is rape. It's forcing people. Free choice, the ability to make mistakes, that we all, if we love our children, when they grow up, we all give them that ability to make mistakes. So we don't tie them down in the house and not let them go out in case they fall, or in case they get hurt, or in case they drive a car and have an accident. No, we let them. We let them knowing that it might happen, that bad might happen, that they might make bad choices. And in the book of Samuel, God allows his children, humanity in general, but Israel, his chosen nation, to make mistakes, big mistakes, mistakes that will cost them dearly. Destruction of the land, destruction of the temple the first time, destruction of the temple the second time, a rejection of the chosen ones that God has chosen. Whether it's the prophets, whether it is the priests, whether it is the leaders. God, like a good father, has enough confidence in us as human beings that if given the right opportunities to do right, we will do right. Now, when you look at history, you look at the world, you say, God made a mistake. No, he didn't. Look at David. He was chosen. And now we talk about many years that he is serving as the musician, as the personal valet of King Saul in the temple. And he knows that he is chosen by God to be the king of Israel. And he stays in the temple, yes, looking for every opportunity to get closer to the crown. Yes, King David is not a fool. He's a calculating young man. We're going to see it in the next chapters. He knows he is the king, chosen by God, but he knows that he cannot do something against King Saul, because King Saul is the anointed one of God. This we will see in the eulogy of King David for Saul and Jonathan after they die on Mount Gilboa. The anointed one of God. And this concept, by the way, is not uniquely Israelite. It is throughout the whole Levant, from Babylon to Egypt. All the kings, the pagan kings, the pharaohs, the Nebuchadnezzar, the Sargons of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, they all believed that they are the chosen God of their God, the chosen ones, the sons of God, that are fed from the breasts of the goddesses of their countries. You can see that plastically on the walls of the temple. In the middle of the Nile, in the island of Elephantine, of Yev. You can see it in the temples in Karnak and Luxor, and on the paintings of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, where the kings, the pharaohs, are sucking from the breast of the goddesses, whether it's Isis, Hathor, Mot, and the other goddesses of Egypt. So King David has that concept. anointed one of God. How can I do something against the anointed of God? He has opportunity to kill him more than once. But he's not going to, because it's not the wise thing to do. But also because he has this concept, he's the anointed one of God. Yes, I've been chosen to be king, but I have to be patient, I have to be smart, I have to play my cards right, I have to be right, just in my relationship with King Saul. So there we are now. King David comes to Nov. Nov, N-O-B in the English Bible. I am in verse 21 of chapter 21 in verse 2. After David, the end of chapter 20, after David swears with Jonathan, they swear to each other, they take an oath with each other. They say that God is going to be with us, between us, in our midst, between my seed and your seed forever. That love of Jonathan and David is sealed with a covenant between the two of them in chapter 20, verse 42, the last verse of chapter 20. And David, Jonathan returns to the city, to Gibeah, and David goes not far from Gibeah. I mean, just an hour's walk, maybe even less than an hour, 40 minutes walk from where Jonathan and King Saul are. He goes up to Nov. Nov is at the head of Mount Scopus. There is today a big German church and hospital, Augusta Victoria, by German missionaries from the last century. That's Nov, the top of Mount of Olives, where the Hebrew University second campus is on Mount Scopus, or the first campus on top of Mount Scopus. He goes there to a priest called Achimelech. And Achimelech is scared when he sees David. And he says, David, why have you come here by yourself? There is no one with you. And David says to Achimelech the priest, the king, King Saul, commanded me and said, go without anybody knowing anything about it, in other words, secretly. I'm sending you and I'm commanding you and the young men that are with you to Makom Ploni Elmoni, to a hoi polloi place, to an undefined place. Yeah. And David says to the priest, you have 5 loaves of bread, give them to me, and everything else that you have for me. And the priest in verse 5 says, Achimelech says to David, I don't have any regular bread. I have holy bread. And that holy bread cannot be eaten unless the men that are with you are holy. That means they have not had sex with a woman or sex at all. And we know that this bread, we're going to see it, the show bread that was changed every week from the table that is inside the Holy of Holies, no, inside the holies of the tabernacle, was baked on the Sabbath day. And it was to be put on the table of the Lord. And David wants that bread. And the priest says, I can't give it to you because, you know, the men that are with you, they can't, they have to be in a holy state. That means that they have to not have had sex with a woman, or anybody else for that matter. Having sex with somebody else wasn't in the picture. Was an offense punishable by death, according to the Torah. But so they can have, and it is the bread of the Lord. Verse 6, and David answers the priest and says to him, verse 6, I need to read that verse in English. Just a minute, because the Hebrew is a little bit complex. The Hebrew is a little bit complex, so I'm going to read it from the King James Version. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 6. So verse 6. No, we're not synchronized. One verse over. In English, verse 6 is different. It's verse 7 of the Hebrew text. For some reason, the verses are not always the same. So it's verse 5 in Hebrew. And David answered the priest and said to him, truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy. And the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. In other words, it was baked this day, but it is still common because it has not been yet put on the table of the Lord itself. That's what David is saying. And then in verse 6, so the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there, but the showbread which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. In other words, they gave David the holy bread, but not the fresh holy bread, last Sabbath's holy bread for his men. This incident becomes a big issue. It becomes a big issue in the New Testament. A big issue. And why has it become a big issue? Because when Yeshua was going with his disciples on the Sabbath day from Nazareth to Capernaum, crossing through the Beit Netivyah valley, a very fertile valley, when that was going on, the disciples got hungry. It's about an eight-hour walk from Nazareth to Capernaum by somebody who's young, strong, and able. A good pace, 8-hour walk. Flat and then downhill. The disciples got hungry and they picked up the green wheat. So sometimes between Passover and Pentecost, Shavuot, when Yeshua was going toward Capernaum from Nazareth. They picked the green wheat and you squeeze it and the kernel pops out, and it's actually called Carmel. It is considered a delicacy. The disciples got hungry. They picked some of the wheat. In English, everything in the time of King James, every cereal was corn. Yeah. In the time of King James, it was called corn. So they picked the corn and they popped the green, and it popped out of its encasing, and the pure kernel of wheat popped into the mouth, and it's very delicious. And so that's what the disciples did. And the Pharisees came. Apparently they were together with Yeshua on that highway, on that road between Nazareth and Capernaum on the Sabbath day, which is another issue altogether with the Sabbath distance and the Tchum Shabbat, and that are limited. And it's another big halachic Jewish law issue. So in this context, Yeshua answered the Pharisees and says, remember David and his men on the Sabbath day. They ate the showbread of the Lord, which is a sin, a big sin, on the Sabbath day. And nobody criticized them, because every time David sinned, he had two prophets, Gad and Nathan, that accompanied him and his company. Every time David sinned, God sent either Gad or Nathan to reprimand David, and David repented. We have one of his Psalms of repentance, Psalms 51, in which David repents profusely before the Lord for his sin with Bathsheba. But in this case, there is no condemnation in the scripture by the prophets or by the scripture of David or of Yeshua's disciples, or of David that is coming there, is lying, is taking the bread for his men, and is taking the sword of Goliath. No condemnation on David in this case. So the Yeshua learns from this that it's okay if somebody is hungry to even take the holy bread of the Lord from the table of the Lord in the tabernacle of the Lord. That's his answer to the Pharisees. And most Christians don't understand the story because they don't know that it's related to this story in chapter 21 in 1 Samuel. So David receives the bread by Ahimelech the priest for his men. Receives the bread and gives it takes it to his men. And then he says to the priest, I don't have a sword. I need a sword. So yeah, the priest gives the bread. I'm back. The order of the verses is different. One verse over. Gives the bread, the showbread that has been taken off before the Lord, in order to put the hot bread in its place on that day when it was taken away. And at that time there was a man from Saul's servants that was the translation in verse 7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, whatever that means, detained before the Lord. And his name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. first of all, it's interesting. You have Doeg the Edomite, the chief herdsman, shepherd of the flocks that belong to the king, to Saul. He is there in the house of the Lord detained. What does it mean, detained? It means that he had taken a vow, had been purified, gone to the immersion, to the mikveh, been baptized in English language, and prepared there, had an issue with something in his life that he decided to stay, sanctify himself in the house of the Lord, in the tabernacle that was there at Nov. And the next verse, and David said to Ahimelech, that's verse 8 in the English, verse 9 in the Hebrew, David said to Ahimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. Remember, he came, he didn't go to the dinner at Saul's house for the feast. And he came from there to Nov. And when he was in front of Saul, into the palace, he didn't walk in with a sword and with a weapon. So he has no weapon in his possession. So he said, I don't have a weapon with me. Is there any sword here that I could take? Ahimelech the priest tells him in verse 9, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah. There it is, wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, take it. For there is no other except that one here. What was the sword of Goliath doing in the tabernacle of the Lord? It's called a votive offering. It is a trophy of the victory of the Lord over the Philistine that David killed. David couldn't have taken it because it was the victory of the Lord, and he gave the credit to the Lord for that victory. So it was put as a trophy in the house of the Lord. This custom is universal. You see it in the Greek temples in Greece. You see it in the Egyptian temples in Egypt. You see it you see the evidence of it in Arad from before 2000 BC, before Abraham even. It was a natural, and in the oldest temple in the world, that's in En-Gedi. We're going to talk about En-Gedi soon. In En-Gedi, up on the mountain, there is, from 7000 BC, the temple, Chalcolithic era, stone era, Stone Age. And there you see all kinds of votive offerings of weapons and maces and ceremonial maces and military maces. Maces is like a metal ball on top of a stick that you bonk people on the head with, crash their helmets and crash their heads with it. So David is offered the sword of Goliath. He's not the whole story here is not innocent. He came there for that sword, because that sword was the sign of his victory over the Philistines, given to him by God himself, according to David and according to the story. It's not his private victory, it is a national victory. And so David takes the sword of Goliath. And in verse 11 of chapter 21, in Hebrew, verse 10, David rose and fled that day from before Saul and went Achish, the king of Gath. In other words, he takes the sword of Goliath and he runs to Achish, a Philistine city. non-Israelite city. He runs to Achish, the king of Gat. Gat was one of the big cities, one of the biggest tells in Israel, maybe the second biggest tell. In other words, mound, archaeological mound, that is created by the fact that there were walls around the city, and when the city destroyed and filled with the dirt fills it, and it becomes like a mound with steep walled, dirt mound around it and flat on top. So David runs from Saul. He realizes that Saul is intent to kill him, and he takes the sword of Goliath, which is a sign of his victory of the Philistines, and runs to the Philistine city of Gat, to the king of Gat, Achish. And the servants of Achish said to Achish, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dance and saying, Saul has slain thousands and David 10,000s? Repetition of that ditty, short song. Maybe not so short. I mean, if we look at the modern songs that the evangelicals sing today, there could be 3, 4 words, and they repeat it for 15, 20 minutes. Over and over and over again, with a band and drums and trumpets, and there's only 3 words, 4 words, 5 words, very short. So the Philistines know of this song and the praise that David received. They know of the praise that David received. Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gat. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, stretched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servant, Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I not enough crazy people around me, madmen around me? You have brought a fellow to play the madman in my presence. Shall this fellow come into my house? In other words, Achish realizes that David is playing, pretending to be mad in order to be received. I mean, he's the one who killed Goliath, won the battle over the Philistines, went later and fought the Philistines and had another victory and another victory over the Philistines. Now he's coming as a madman, begging, acting crazy to be received by the Gentile pagan king of Gat, Achish. This is the end of chapter 21. I'm going to end here, and I am going to continue chapter 22 in the next lesson. God bless you all. Read the text. Enjoy reading the text. Read it not as a holy book. Read it as a book first. Then the holiness of the text is going to influence you. But if you start reading it as a holy book, there's going to be different filters that your mind is going to create that will prevent you from seeing the full picture. Because the text is written for human beings with limitations, with interests, with prejudices. So if you just read it like a novel, you'll gain more out of it, because the spiritual part of it is going to enter into you without the filters that religion builds into us. I'll tell you about a guy in 1974 knocked on my door after midnight, total stranger, And he said, my name is Lagarde Smith, very famous lawyer, the dean of Pepperdine Law School for many, many years, then the dean of Liberty College, Falwell's College in Virginia. Before he was a professor of law, he was the Attorney General of Oakland County in California. Great guy. And he came to me and said, listen, I came to you because I need help. I'm losing my faith. Because what I read in the Bible and what I hear at church are two so different things. I can't reconcile both of them. And my father was an elder in the church, and I was raised this way, and now when I read the Bible, I see that it's totally different than what the church was talking about. And I'm losing my faith. So I let him in, and he stayed about several weeks in my house, slept on the couch in the living room. He was unmarried. He married when he was 50. Great guy, great friend, and a sharp mind, sharp person, very sharp person, sharp lawyer, sharp professor of law, and a devout disciple of Yeshua. Devout disciple, servant of God. So the first thing I told him is, don't worry about your faith. Start reading the Bible from Genesis on. And he did. And as a lawyer, he analyzed everything he read for the first time in his life. The whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. He read it in my house. And the first book he published, he's published hundreds of books. Lagarde F. Smith. You can Google him, you can see hundreds of books. Wonderful books. Very important books. And the first book he published that is still in all the Bible stores in America and in other places, it's called The Narrated Bible, which he tried to make sense and arrange the text chronologically. And the Narrated Bible is his. And it started because he started reading the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. It's something that is good to do. God bless all of you. See you in the next lesson. Bye.